Okay, I think we can start. If our panelists want to put their videos on, that'd be great. Right, okay. So welcome everyone to our Uncontacted Tribes Week webinar. I'm really glad you all could join us today, and also hi to anyone on YouTube. We've got three speakers with us today. I'll be your host. I'm Paula. I'm working the comms team for Survival, and I'm really glad to be joined by my colleagues who work in the Uncontacted Tribes team. The point of this webinar really is to highlight why Survival is campaigning so much for uncontacted tribes' rights. Really, it is centered about their survival and the fight against essentially genocide of those people, because they really are some of the most vulnerable people on the planet. And it's a really crucial humanitarian issue that we're talking about here. So yeah, it's really important to highlight the fact that international support is really is key to their survival. So I'm really glad to see so many of you here with us today. And yeah, the structure of this talk will essentially be this quick introduction by me, and then each of our speakers will give a 5-minute sort of roundup of their key areas, which they'll explain to you in a second. And then we'll hopefully have plenty of time for questions. So if you do have questions, please pop them in the chat here on Zoom, not in the Q&A. We'll be monitoring the chat, not the Q&A. And if you're on YouTube, please leave them in the comments. So yeah, without further ado, Sarah, can you introduce yourself quickly?
Thanks, Paula. Hi, everyone. My name's Sarah. I am a campaigner at Survival International. I coordinate our Uncontacted Tribes campaign, and I focus largely on Brazil.
Great, thanks. And Sophie?
Hi, I'm Sophie Grigg. I work on our Uncontacted and also our conservation campaigns in Asia.
Great. And Teresa?
Hi everyone, my name is Teresa and I am one of the campaigners of Survival Uncontacted campaign, focusing on South America and more specifically in Peru and Paraguay.
Okay, great. Thanks for quick introductions. I think maybe let's start with Sarah, and she can hopefully explain a bit more about Survival's background with Uncontacted Tribes, as well as, Sarah, if you could tell us a bit more about your focus area as well.
Sure. So Survival International was founded in 1969, as some of you may know, and since then we've been fighting alongside Indigenous peoples around the world for the protection of their lands and for their survival. And our Uncontacted Tribes campaign has always been one of our main focus areas. It's a global campaign, global in two senses. First of all, global in terms of our objectives of the campaign. So we are fighting for the lands of uncontacted tribes around the world, wherever they may be, to be protected, because that's the only way that they can survive. And there are more than 100 uncontacted tribes around the world, in the Amazon rainforest mainly, but also in the Chaco forest, as we'll hear from Teresa, and in India, Indonesia, and West Papua, as we'll hear from Sophie. And the second element of the global nature of the campaign is that it's global in terms of who's participating in the campaign. And the global movement has supporters in more than 100 different countries. And we rely on supporters like everybody here and others to join the campaigns, to participate, because we see, as you said, Paula, that international public pressure really can make a difference. So for Brazil, well, as I'm sure most people here know, the current Brazilian government under President Bolsonaro has basically waged war against all of Brazil's indigenous peoples, and uncontacted tribes are the most vulnerable of all. And what we're seeing is an ongoing genocide. It's not a memory from the past or a threat for the future. It's a current genocide against which uncontacted tribes and all indigenous peoples in the country are are fighting. And this is a war that the government has waged through its words, its racist words, also its policies. And the ultimate aim, of course, of President Bolsonaro and his agribusiness allies is to steal indigenous peoples' territories and make profit from them through mining, through agribusiness, etc. Bearing in mind that, of course, these are the most biodiverse territories in Brazil and often on the planet, the places where uncontacted tribes live, because they're the best guardians of their lands. And this ongoing genocide in Brazil has many different elements to it. One thing that the indigenous people are fighting against very strongly at the moment, and survival as well, is the mining bill, which is a proposal to open up indigenous territories for large-scale mining. Another thing is the time limit trick, known as the marco temporal in Portuguese, which is a really dangerous proposal, again, coming from the agribusiness lobby, stating that only if indigenous people can prove they were on their territories on the day the constitution was signed, the 5th of October 1988, only then can they have their lands demarcated now. And of course, in many cases, they weren't on those lands then because they'd been forcibly evicted. And so those are two elements of the ongoing genocide. Of course, there are many others. And this, what we're talking about, is the risk of wiping out entire uncontacted tribes. We see in Brazil and beyond that where the borders of uncontacted tribes' territories are protected from invaders, and where governments do uphold their national laws and international law as well and keep the invaders out, uncontacted tribes can thrive. And I don't know if, Paula, if we can bring up an image of an uncontacted tribe in Acre, where we can see that they look healthy and their bodies are painted with genipapo and urucum paints that they get from the forest, and they've got baskets full of manioc and other products from their gardens. But of course, as we know, in many cases, the lands aren't being protected. And for example, in the Yanomami territory in northern Brazil and southern Venezuela, on the Brazil side alone, the Yanomami are warning that there are more than 20,000 illegal gold miners there right now. Survival was very heavily involved alongside the Yanomami and other allies in the campaign for the demarcation of their territory, which eventually happened in 1992. That was a very important moment in the history of the Yanomami in their land fight. But now the gold miners are back, polluting the rivers with mercury, spreading malaria, attacking and killing the Yanomami. So the Yanomami are campaigning internationally. We recently had a visit from Mauricio Yanomami to the UK and to Spain, France, Germany, and other countries, in which he spoke out and lobbied for the eviction of the gold miners from the Yanomami's territory, bearing in mind that there are uncontacted Yanomami there alongside those Yanomami who do have contact. Oh, and this is an image of the devastating impacts that the gold mining has on the Yanomami's forest. The Javari Valley is an indigenous territory in Brazil where there are more uncontacted tribes than anywhere else. And again, it's being heavily invaded by illegal miners, loggers, poachers, and drug traffickers. And that is the area where, as many of you will know, that is where our friends Bruno Pereira and Dom Phillips, the indigenous rights expert Bruno and the British journalist Dom Phillips, were killed recently. And the killing of Bruno and Dom wouldn't have happened if it weren't for this genocide, this war that President Bolsonaro has waged against indigenous peoples and the invaders in their territories. And actually, Bruno's funeral is happening now as we speak. So I just wanted to remember him and how important he is. He's a good friend and ally of ours, and he's central in the fight for the protection of uncontacted tribes land. He is a real fighter, and he achieved so much even in the harshest of contexts. He also taught us a great deal, and his passion and work will always live on. If we jump thousands of kilometers to the east of the Brazilian Amazon, and I think we've got another photo, don't we, Paula? If we jump to the east of the Brazilian Amazon, the uncontacted Awa live there. Again, there are some uncontacted, some contacted relatives. And they are one of the most threatened tribes on earth. The Awa and also the Guajajara people who live in the region have formed these groups of guardians who are indigenous men who go out on patrols, and some women now, actually, there are now some women participating as well, going out on patrols in their forest to evict the illegal loggers, because they see that the government isn't doing that, so they've got to take matters into their own hands for the well-being of their own families, but also for the survival of their uncontacted relatives. And survival is working with the guardians and supporting them in several different ways. And finally, from Brazil, I wanted to highlight land protection orders. That might sound a bit technical, but actually these are really, really important emergency measures that the Brazilian government can use to keep invaders out of uncontacted tribes' lands when those lands haven't yet been demarcated and officially recognized as indigenous territories, as the constitution obliges. And currently there are 7 territories in Brazil which are or are supposed to be under land protection orders, and those territories cover more than 1 million hectares of Amazon rainforest. But of course, President Bolsonaro and his allies don't want these orders to exist. They want to rip them up altogether. They want to open up and steal these territories. They'd much rather these uncontacted tribes didn't exist so that they can use the land. So Survival is campaigning for these orders to be renewed. And actually yesterday we received some really good news that the Itunaitata land protection order, that's one of these 7 territories, was renewed for 3 years. That wouldn't have happened without all the pressure from all of our supporters and the campaign that we're running alongside organizations in Brazil. So that was really a relief and great news. And I just want to now pass the word to Rita, who is from the Piripkura tribe, and a film that we filmed with her on the border of her indigenous territory.
O que é Piripicura, que é minha terra, que é a Rita. Gente que quer curar, que muito lugar, que daqui café tudinho, né? Que matou tudinho. Minha tia, não, é minha tia não. É minha sogra que matou, minha sogra que matar. 9 filhas. Vambora, matou, vambora, outro lado, para. Aí vem pra cá, né? Aí gira, vai em cima, né? Pera, aí fiquei para canoa, aí que vambora. Aí, muito lugar, né? Muito lugar, manhã tem jícoro, muito de pinho, vento, rio, que vai embora pra cá. Aqui, ó. Procura pra cá. Branca com tcheco. Aí eu cortar, né? Aqui, ó. Minha avó. Aí falou, não. E parou para mim, né? Não, chora não. A branca com que cortou, eu falou. Aí eu falei, meu pai falou, né? Não é branca aqui, não é o macaco. Não é macaco, rapaz. É para em branco, tá? E quando é que derruba muito o dia, manteiga? Aí eu parei a caça também, tem, né? Aí minha mãe fica lá, eu, tudo aqui, ó. Tudo aqui, ó. Andando. Tá minha irmã. Tô eu, minha irmã, meu pai, minha mãe, meu irmão. E eu, tô. Aí tudo aqui, procurando aqui andar. Meu irmão, esse aí. Meu irmão, a outra aqui tamanduá, aqui é minha tumbinha. Tem doida. Agora que eu vi da tapiri, eu tô pensando que matar, que tem muita gente que andando, tá? Que vai matar é de doida, matar aí, ó, não tem mais.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for all the information you gave us. Lots going on there, and in such a short space of time as well. I've seen we've got some questions already, but we'll look at those later. Just to welcome anyone who's joining us now, we're live on our Uncontacted Tribes Week webinar. So welcome. I think we'll move on to the rest of South America now with Teresa, who will be giving a small sort of introduction and explanation about what's going on there.
Okay, thanks, Paula. So after Brazil, Peru is the second country in the world with the highest concentration of uncontacted tribes, and most of them live on the Amazonian frontier between Peru and Brazil and move across borders as is natural to them. And as Sarah said, they are the most vulnerable peoples, and their survival depends entirely on their land being protected. In Peru, the legal way of protecting uncontacted tribes territories is through the creation of indigenous reserves. And according to the law, all activity from outsiders is completely forbidden inside these reserves. Indigenous peoples, their orgs, and survival and allies have been lobbying the Peruvian government for decades for the creation of these reserves. And some have already been declared and created, but for others, the procedure is delayed or even frozen for decades. On other occasions, despite having achieved the creation of the reserves, the government is allowing the overlapping of logging, oil and gas concessions over the territory of the uncontacted tribes. And this, as you can imagine, is a huge threat to them. And there is a huge aggressive opposition from powerful oil and gas and logging companies to the creation of these reserves, and often with the support of politicians at regional and also state level that seek personal profiting. And these sectors just a few weeks ago, for example, have gone so far as to ask to repeal or withdraw the national law for the protection of uncontacted tribes, and even to deny again their existence, something that has no basis today, as it's a speech that is largely outdated. Survival together with Peru indigenous peoples and organizations are lobbying currently right now, like we are lobbying the government to respect uncontacted tribes and create these reserves and protect them quickly and effectively, which includes canceling all logging concessions inside them and expelling immediately all extractive companies. And we have a clip, a video, Paula from Zoila Merino, who is a Bora woman from the Bora people in Peru, and she is part of an indigenous organization. This one, is part of one of Peruvian indigenous organizations that is pushing very, very hard for the creation of the reserves.
Venimos trabajando defendiendo los derechos de los pueblos en aislamiento voluntario. Ellos son los hermanos que viven en la selva, que no nos contactamos con ellos directamente, pero son ellos quienes protegen el territorio. Con todas las evidencias que hemos hecho, los 170 testimonios. Esos testimonios no hemos sacado así nomás de aquí, sino hemos sacado yendo a los lugares de las comunidades que viven en las zonas de influencia. A ellos se les ha consultado, pues hemos hecho el trabajo, pero sin embargo, hasta el día de hoy, 8 estudios se ha hecho, pero sin embargo, hasta ahorita el Ministerio de Cultura no dice nada, no sé cuál es que nos sacan una resolución de aprobación para que se tenga consideración y se considere a los hermanos que se encuentran ahí protegidos.
Okay, so she speaks about all the work they are doing, and it's the government who should be doing that. And even with that big force that they are doing, the state is not listening or behaving the way it should. So indigenous peoples are doing its part, and we can also make our part. And Surabaya has this link. I don't know if we have put the link already in the chat for the action. So everyone can send their email to ask the Peruvian government to protect the indigenous reserves and uncontacted tribes that live there. And the other case we are focusing on is Paraguay, where the uncontacted Ayureo are, and they are the last uncontacted tribe in South America that live outside the Amazon rainforest. And their territory is in the Paraguayan Chaco, which is the second largest forest in South America. And the Chaco forest is very different from the Amazon. It's a dry forest with low trees, cactus, and bushes. And it's a forest that, to me, it may seem highly hostile, but which the Ayureo know perfectly well and which they depend on. But the survival is under great threat today. This is the result of, on the one hand, the forced contacts made by fundamentalist missionary groups in the last decades of the last century. And on the other hand, the enormous speed of deforestation in the Chaco by agribusiness companies, and with the complicity of politicians and many institutions of the Paraguayan state. And today, the uncontacted Ayureo continue to resist in what is left of their forest, and the Ayureo that were forced to settle continue to fight for the territory to be protected so that their uncontacted relatives can survive. And survival has been fighting alongside them since the 80s. And we have been lobbying the state to return the land to the Ayureo. And some parts have already been titled, but many others have not. So the Ayureo don't have a continuous land, but disconnected areas, pieces of land. And as the Paraguayan state is not upholding its own laws, the Ayureo appealed to the Inter-American Commissions, and they asked the commission to order the state to expel the companies and give them their land back. And the struggle for the uncontacted Ayureo is currently at a tipping point. We can say, there's two reasons we can mention. The first reason is that deforestation in the Chaco continues to advance rapidly. There's not much time. We should remember that Paraguay has one of the fastest rate of deforestation in the world. And the second is that the Inter-American Commission will make its decision on the Ayureo land claim in the coming months. And it's crucial for the survival of the uncontacted Ayureo that it's favorable to them. We have a video with some testimonies from the Ayureo. Can we play it, Paula?
I've got the Tierra Ayureo. When is that the one?
Tierra Ayureo. Mm-hmm.
Los años 79 hubo primer contacto. No fue un contacto así que la gente del monte quería. Después de eso, los estudiosos fallecieron también por la enfermedad.
I think you're muted, Teresa, I think.
Yeah, sorry. No, just mention that we are using the hashtag Tierra Lloreo on social media to speak about what's going on in their land. And also we have an action, an email action to lobby the government, the government, so that they give the Lloreo their land back. So we have it in the chat, I think, or not yet.
Yes, I think it's been shared already.
Okay.
So thank you.
So that's from me.
Thank you, Teresa, for that. Really interesting and important issues you're highlighting with your part of the campaign. I'd like to just quickly jump back to something Sarah mentioned. Well, not really. If you remember Rita's tribal voice video testimony, I forgot to mention that actually we're showing right now for Uncontacted Tribes Week, we've got the film Piripkura, which is to do with Rita's tribe and her relatives, uncontacted relatives. And we've got that available for you to watch at home whenever you like. So I hope my team's popped that in the chat, pop the link where you can watch that. Or if not, they will soon. But yeah, I thought I'd just mention that in case anyone's interested in seeing a bit more about the Piripkura tribe and what the land protection orders issue that Sarah was talking about might affect. So anyway, returning back to our little timeline, I think, yeah, Sophie's up next and our last speaker for today before we head on to questions. So I'll hand over to Sophie.
Thanks, Paola. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the uncontacted tribes in Asia, and probably the best known uncontacted tribe in Asia are the Sentinelese, who live on their own island in the Andaman Islands, about 500 miles off the coast of India. Being on their own island with no neighbours probably makes them the most isolated tribe in the world. We actually know very little about them. We don't know what they call themselves. Nobody can speak their language. We think there are probably about 100 people living in 3 separate nomadic bands. And they first came to worldwide attention in 2004 after the devastating Asian tsunami, where a Coast Guard helicopter flew over and just to check to see if they were okay, and took a photo of Sentinelese people firing arrows at the helicopter. I think we have a picture that you may recognize from that time. And the government in India has tried to contact the Sentinelese many times, starting with contact missions in the 1970s, giving them or putting gifts of coconuts sort of on the shore quickly and running away, or tipping coconuts into the water. These were often little more than glorified picnics for VIPs who wanted to go and have an adventure in the islands. And obviously putting the Sentinelese at enormous risk. And the Sentinelese remain sort of hostile to this and hostile to any other attempts to contact them, except in a brief period during the 1990s where they actually accepted some gifts. They didn't allow people to land on their island, but they accepted a few, some coconuts. But this stopped pretty much as abruptly as it started, and no one knows why they first dropped and then reinstated their great hostility to people getting
I think we've lost.
And then started again as we have a short video from one. Can you show that out? Oh no. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Am I back?
Oh, okay. Yeah, Sophie, I think your connection's dropped a bit. We can see you now and we could hear you. I've shown the video in case you missed that. I hope everyone else managed to see that. It was a little clip of the Sentinelese receiving a few gifts, it looks like. So yeah, please continue.
So yeah, I don't know if you heard where I was explaining that was during a very brief period in the 90s when they did accept, they didn't allow people to land on the shore, but they did allow people to get close without attacking them with arrows, but they then resumed their hostility. And the Sentinelese face danger from poachers. The poachers go and fish around their territory, and also they're at risk from attempts to missionize them. People might remember in 2018, an American missionary called John Allen Chow landed on their island in an attempt to bring Christianity to them, but he was killed by them for trying to do that. It's very difficult to find out about the other uncontacted tribes in Asia. We believe there are uncontacted tribes in Indonesia and also in West Papua, but there's no government agency trying to monitor them or work out how many there are or where there are, like there is in places like Brazil or Peru. We do know that the Ohongona Manyawa, who live in North Maluku, they're a tribe who missionaries contacted and settled, many of them in the 70s and 80s, and built settlements for them. But there are still 4 bands that remain nomadic and living in the forest. Tupa is one, and you can see her here, and she and her band have limited contact, mostly through intermediaries, but there are believed to be 3 uncontacted bands. And this community are at great risk because there's a huge amount of mining in their area. In their province alone, there's 300 mining licenses have been granted. But their particular forest is threatened by nickel mining to make batteries for electric cars. I think we have one more picture of one of their temporary houses in the forest. And in Indonesia, thanks Paula. In Indonesia, there's a big attempt by government to settle nomadic peoples and to contact any uncontacted communities. The Indonesian government seems to find it an embarrassment to have peoples who are nomadic, and so they make a great effort to try and settle and to integrate, as they describe it, nomadic peoples into the mainstream society. We believe that there are in Sulawesi, there is a community called the Polahi who actually had contact and then fled from colonists Dutch colonists in the 17th century, and went into the forest and have remained with very little contact since then. And though some have been settled fairly recently, we believe there are still others who are not. Also in Sumatra, I met Orang Rimba, an elderly Orang Rimba man told me that he knew of uncontacted Orang Rimba in the forest. It seems incredible, so much of their forest has been destroyed. There's such a small amount left because of just remaining small amounts of oil palm, but because of so much oil palm. But if anyone has the knowledge of the forest to hide and stay, then it's going to be nomadic peoples like the Orang Rimba. And also we believe in West Papua, the western half of the island of New Guinea, there are some uncontacted peoples. It's been occupied brutally by the Indonesians since the 1960s, but in the 1990s, missionaries investigated and did a big search, evangelical Christian missionaries, and found what they believed to be 40 uncontacted tribes in the early 1990s. And although many of those have been settled since then, and by missionaries and also by government attempts, we believe that there are some family groups who have resisted that and are still living without contact with the missionaries or the government. And I shall stop there because I've gone over time already.
That's okay. There's a lot to talk about. So yeah, thank you for summarizing that into what was about 6 minutes or 7. So that's, a lot in a short space of time. But anyway, yeah, let's not waste any more time with my uttering either, and let's get on to some questions. So I think our first question just coming to me from Raymond. He asks, the white colonial devastation has been going on since 1492. Do you realistically believe that the greed will ever stop?
Well, no. The greed doesn't stop, and that's why the fight back doesn't stop either. And Indigenous people are telling us all the time and every day, everything that we're talking about now is not a new situation for them. They've been fighting back against this theft of their land and the destruction of their land, which is, of course, the means of their survival since the Europeans colonized. So no, the greed won't stop. They won't stop fighting. We won't stop fighting either. And we know that it works. The fight back does work. Even in Brazil, with President Bolsonaro, we have seen that the fight back from the indigenous movement and their allies has made a difference. If they hadn't led the biggest ever protest for indigenous rights, as they did in the first year of his presidency, if they haven't since then been lobbying non-stop, protesting non-stop in all sorts of ways, and Survival and other allies, of course, alongside them day in, day out. If it hadn't been for that, then I think we'd be seeing a much worse situation in Brazil at the moment.
Yeah, something. Yeah, we can also see that, for example, with the Ayoreo case, that the Chaco is completely deforested. Like there's a small part of forest in the north, and in the area where the Ayoreo land is only like almost an island. It's not completely closed as other areas, but it's almost closed, a green island surrounded by deforestation. So that has only happened because of the Toto Vigo, so they have been fighting back.
I was just going to say that, of course, a lot of it is to do with greed and theft of land, but it's also to do with a sort of racist beliefs and a misunderstanding of uncontacted peoples, and a sort of idea that uncontacted peoples have been left behind and, you know, failed to sort of modernize, all of which is completely untrue. And uncontacted peoples, of course, are just as modern, just as contemporary as us, and they are making an active choice to stay uncontacted. Nobody is uncontacted because they've been sort of left behind or forgotten. And so I think there's also that danger, particularly in Asia, where there's a really strong sort of desire to sort of integrate and to sort of bring people into the mainstream, and that has to be resisted as well.
Okay, great. Thank you for each of your answers. Our next question from Angela. I'm shocked there are still missionaries doing this around the world. Where are they mainly from? And is this also an issue in South America?
Sarah, do you want to start and talk about in Brazil?
I was just thinking that, go on, Sophie, you can take this one.
Well, I was going to say yes. I mean, unfortunately, missionaries are a problem still going in and searching out. I mean, we could see in the 90s in West Papua that they were actively searching out uncontacted peoples. And there are missionary organizations like the New Tribes Mission that's actually, you know, part written into their sort of constitution, that's what they're searching for, these uncontacted peoples, despite the fact that they know that devastation and the amount of disease and disaster that will always befall when uncontacted peoples are contacted, because they're so vulnerable to diseases from outside. And we see this happening, and it's not just Christian missionaries, it's Muslim missionaries in Indonesia as well. And we've seen with Bolsonaro, as Sarah I'm sure can tell you more, you know, the big rise of the evangelical missionaries again out in South America and in Brazil.
Yeah, and Sophie's been deeply following the movements of these missionaries around the world and the threats that they pose to uncontacted tribes. And as you say, Sophie, in Brazil, I mean, one of the first things that happened in the Uncontacted Tribes Department of FUNAI, the Indigenous Affairs Department of the Brazilian government in the Ministry of Justice, was that they put in there an evangelical missionary as the coordinator, Ricardo Lopes Dias. And of course, him there was a threat to all uncontacted tribes in Brazil and beyond, I'd say, actually, given that many countries, governments and policies, they turn to Brazil as a sort of, you know, an example to follow. And given that, of course, Ricardo Lopes Dias, along with all the other evangelical people in Congress, wouldn't want to protect these territories. Quite the opposite. He'd want to ensure forced contact with these peoples to bring them the word of God, and that's what he had been working in previously in the Javari Valley and other places. So we, alongside other organizations, had to lead a call for him to be removed from that department. That's not the sort of campaign we normally would do, but we made an exception in that case, given that we know what dangers evangelical missionaries pose to uncontacted tribes.
Okay, ready for our next question. Number 3. So question from Sylvia. Is Bolsonaro above the law? Why can't he be held accountable for what he does? So I'm assuming this is more for Sarah.
Yeah, that's a good question. And he's not above the law, even though he and his colleagues use all sorts of tactics to try to show that they're doing exactly the opposite of what they're really doing. In Portuguese, in Brazil, there's an expression, para o inglês ver, which literally means for the Englishman to see, which means, you know, you do things to pretend everything's okay when actually it's the opposite. So when they say that they're protecting the forest, but actually we know that they're soaring deforestation rates. Anyway, that and also all sorts of other tactics that they use to try to get away with these criminal actions of theirs, but they're not above the law. They are being held to account. The indigenous movement has its own set of lawyers as well now. The APIB, the Associação dos Povos Indígenas do Brasil, which is an umbrella organization encompassing lots of different indigenous organizations across the country. They've got their team of lawyers, which is working really hard and taking specific actions that the Bolsonaro government is doing in particular cases, taking them to the Supreme Court, taking them outside Brazil as well. Survival also has been lobbying the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, sending them information, and other organizations as well.
Okay, thank you. A question from Ian, sorry. Where is the UN in all of this? Shouldn't there be a UN task force monitoring what is going on?
Yeah.
Okay.
I feel like I'm talking too much, but yes, the UN does follow to a certain extent what is going on. There are teams within the UN that are aware of the issues to do with uncontacted tribes, and Survival and others also send updates and information to certain teams at the UN, and they have made some declarations and they have pushed certain governments on certain points. But of course, it's, you know, it's the governments aren't respecting at the end of the day the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which exists. It's not a hard law. The only hard law for the rights of Indigenous peoples internationally is Convention 169 of the International Labour Organization. The UN Declaration is a norm which governments should be held to account with, and all of these are things that we in the campaign do use to, you know, as part of our lobbying work. I don't know if Sophie or Teresa want to add anything.
No, just to add that it's indigenous organizations and indigenous peoples and organizations like Survival that we provide the information, we give them input so that the UN react, because it's we need like to attract their attention to a topic that is not among their priorities.
Sophia, would you like to add anything, or are you happy to move on to the next question?
I'm happy to move on. I think.
Okay, great. Sure. We've got one from Barbara here. They ask, how do we make more people recognize this as a human rights issue and as an environmental issue?
Do you want me to have a go? Well, I mean, I think there is a huge amount of interest in uncontacted tribes. When John Allen Chow was killed by the Sentinelese in 2018, it was an enormous story. It carried on for 2 weeks. Journalists were saying to me, we can't believe there is still interest in this story. And I think if we can harness that amount of interest and the sort of passion that was showed about that to the challenge to campaign for the rights of uncontacted tribes, to be writing to these governments, to be making sure that the land of uncontacted tribes is protected, to ensure that the governments are not attempting to make contact, that missionaries are not allowed there. I think if we could harness that passion, then we can enable the uncontacted peoples to carry on, to continue to live in their forests to continue the way of life that they're choosing to live, and enable them and the environments that they're living in to thrive. And we know, as you mentioned in the question, that it is a question also of the environment, because where uncontacted tribes are, where indigenous peoples are, and where those lands are protected are the best areas of forest in the world. It's 80% indigenous peoples' land is on 80% of the most biodiverse lands on Earth. And for example, in the Andaman Islands, where the uncontacted and the recently contacted tribes live, they're the only places of existing rainforest left in the Andaman Islands. And so there is this connection between the indigenous people and the protection of the forest, because they're the best people to protect it. So absolutely, we need to get people fired up, campaigning, writing, getting involved. And we know it makes a difference. For example, the Sentinelese, there was a plan. The government's original plan was to make contact. They had all these missions, but partly as a result of Survival's campaign, they abandoned that and have a new policy not to make contact with the Sentinelese. And we see the effects, like Sarah said about the LPO, our campaigning makes a difference. So getting involved, taking action really does make a difference.
I think more and more people are recognizing around the world, aren't they, that indigenous peoples are the best conservationists. And that's something that, of course, indigenous peoples themselves have, that's something they and their allies have always known. But more and more people are recognizing their key role in the fight against climate change. So therefore, of course, and as Sophie says, because they're protecting the most biodiverse places on Earth, it is an environmental question. But as the question that we're answering implies, it is also a human rights question. It's primarily a human rights question, obviously, because these people have the right to exist as human beings and to live and to survive and to live in the way they choose, regardless of the amazing service they're providing to all humanity as the best conservationists. And actually, I'd also encourage people, if you haven't seen already, to have a look at one of our other major campaigns, which is our Decolonize Conservation campaign, because what we see in many places, particularly, but not only in Africa and Asia, is that despite being the best conservationists, and I'm not talking now about uncontacted necessarily, but indigenous peoples more generally, in many places they're being killed and tortured in the name of conservation. Their rights are being violated. So I'd encourage people to have a look at our campaign to stop those human rights violations that are happening with the support of big conservation organizations like WWF and others in the name of conservation. And also it's a campaign, of course, for indigenous peoples to be placed at the center of the conservation movement.
Teresa, do you want to add anything or not? Not really, you're good. Okay, great. Next question from Raynon. Are the Sentinelese at risk from rising sea levels and climatic changes to their ocean food sources? And is there much risk of mineral exploitation in the Papua regions of Indonesia and is there much risk of mineral exploitation in the Papua regions of Indonesia regions?
In terms of, well, I think the Sentinelese are at greater risk from poaching at the moment, but in the long term, I'm not sure about the sea rises. There hasn't been much, I've not seen much written about that or mentioned about that. I mean, certainly the tsunami actually twisted the island and much of the Andaman Islands on their axis. The force of the tsunami did that. So their land is changing. Whether it will be affected by rising sea levels, I'm sure over time. But at the moment, most crucially, the important thing is to ensure that nobody goes onto their territory, nobody goes and fishes in their waters, nobody tries to hunt on their land. And at the moment, people are pretty frightened of the Sentinelese because they've very rightly defended their island very strongly. But we know that there are poachers who go and try and fish in their waters, and if they get washed ashore, which has happened before with fishermen who have become unmoored and got washed ashore, they could pass on deadly diseases. And absolutely, extraction, mining, oil palm, other plantations, massive problems all over Indonesia and West Papua, huge problems that rampant impact on the lands of indigenous peoples, which we must stop.
Yeah, thank you for the answer, Sophie. Our next question from Julio. How much effect have survival campaigns in the past had so far? I often write many emails to support your campaigns through mail bombing. I wonder in what cases and how much effect this strategy has had.
Yeah, the campaigns have made a real impact, not only for uncontacted tribes, but Indigenous peoples more generally. How best to explain this? Maybe each of us could give one example from our areas of a key success. So I'll start. The Awa territory that I mentioned before, there were thousands of illegal loggers there destroying that territory. That's the place where I said the Awa are one of the most threatened tribes on earth. And we ran a new phase of our campaign to push the Brazilian government to evict those loggers. This was some years ago. And it did involve thousands of emails sent to the Ministry of Justice, as well as many other campaigning actions. The email actions don't happen on their own as a sort of an isolated campaigning tool, but we do all sorts of other things, some of which are behind the scenes, some of which are more public, some of which involve supporters in all sorts of different ways. And that campaign as a whole, including the email actions, did succeed in doing what many had told us was impossible, and encouraging the Brazilian government to send hundreds of troops in to evict the illegal loggers from the Awa territory.
Yeah, to continue with South America. In Peru, for example, there was not that many years ago that the government was denying the mere existence of the uncontacted. So international pressure and conversations and pressure from people from around the world makes have an impact and makes the governments have to change their speech, because it's not that much their minds, but at least their speech. And in Peru, for example, we have seen how last year, at the beginning of the year, the Jabarita Beach Indigenous Reserve was created. For that person that made the question, he or she has probably sent that email to the Peruvian government. And also the Cacataibo Indigenous Reserve was approved. We are still using the same method for the other indigenous reserves, but as Sarah said, this is only one part of the lobby strategy, and this is the part when we ask our supporters to do their part. And in the case of Paraguay, the Ayoreo, I have mentioned before that the Ayoreo already have titles to some of their of some parts of their territory, because their territory is big, but it's like divided, and the titles are in the hands of different people and companies. So we have been lobbying the government and sending them also emails, and the lands, the pieces of lands they have, it's a result of their hard work and their hard fight, and also the support of survival supporters doing this kind of things.
I'm reminded of something that happened in the campaign in the Andaman Islands. So we were campaigning not only for the Sentinelese not to be contacted at all, but in the 90s, we were campaigning, there was the Jaroa, another tribe in the Andamans, who at that point were only contacted in terms of people visiting once a month on going to the beach and meeting them there, and the government had a plan to forcibly settle the Jaroa and put them into, build settlements for them, because this was their idea of sort of development and what should happen. And Survival had a major campaign against that. And at that time, we were asking our supporters, as well as writing letters, but to send faxes. And we knew that the Ministry of Tribal Affairs in Delhi was receiving, we got a message from somebody in the Ministry of Tribal Affairs saying the fax machine just has not stopped. All these faxes are coming through all the time, day and night, about the Jaroa. And now the minister has ordered an investigation into what's happening there. And as a result of that, and obviously the activities of people campaigning in the Andamans in India too, The plan to forcibly settle the Jarawa was completely abandoned. The plan to try and make contact with the Sentinelese was abandoned. And that's one of those rare occasions where there's someone in the office where the machine is whirring that actually feeds back to us, and we can really know that how much they notice those letters and faxes coming in. So yes, that was the example that sprang to mind with that question.
Cool, thank you. Really great to hear those little snippets of your stories and experiences on our campaigns and the reaction of others. I think we've got time probably for just one last question. I'm going to choose the one from Abhijit. He says, or maybe not he, sorry for assuming there, I am from India. How can I help in protection of uncontacted tribes in the Amazon?
Hi, it's really great to know that we've got people here from all around the world. I haven't managed, sadly, to follow the whole chat, but I can see there's some people from Italy, some people from India. Did I see someone who has a French sounding name? So great that we've got people from lots of different places. And yes, in order to campaign for the rights of the peoples in the Amazon, please do engage in those key actions. Maybe we can post them one more time in the chat. The key actions that we're taking for uncontacted tribes there, principally in Brazil and Peru, but also other places. And follow us on social media and follow Indigenous organizations to stay tuned as to what's happening. And we've also got a project called Tribal Voice, which some of you may already be aware of, which is a video project where we invite Indigenous people to send us video messages, 2 minutes each, talking about whatever they want, and we translate them into many languages. That's quite a key tool in terms of getting their messages out quickly and directly to the world. So I'd encourage people also to watch and share those videos. Often they are by contacted relatives or neighbors of uncontacted tribes.
Okay, well, if that will be that. Thank you so much to our speakers for joining us today and sharing all of this information and experience with us. And a really huge thank you to you watching in our audience, whether you're here on Zoom or on YouTube. It's been great to see so many of you here interested in uncontacted tribes and our campaigns. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to answer all of these questions. Definitely on YouTube, if there are still any unreplied ones, we will be able to respond to those by writing answers later. But otherwise, if you really do have urgent questions for us, you can DM us on social media or send us an email with your question and we can get back to you that way. And I really urge you all to take action however you can. We've had some links dropped in the chats here. It'd be really great if you could go through those actions, whichever ones you choose, hopefully all of them. But there you go. We've also got the main uncontacted page. So that's svalint.org/uncontacted tribes, and you can find all the information there, all the key actions we've got going on there in one place. So that's also been dropped in the chat. And yeah, just reiterating, thank you for your support. And as you heard from our campaigners, we really can't do it without you. And it is really important that the global movement does work together as one on this campaign and all the sub campaigns that we've heard about today. And yeah, we'll keep in touch and I'll let you know of the developments of these campaigns. And yeah, I hope you all have a really good end of your Uncontacted Tribes Week and get involved as much as you can. So thank you. We'll be ending that there.
Thanks, everyone.